Hello, and thank you for joining us here at Hybrid Radio. Today we are talking with Sam Lipski, co-author of Let My People Go, The Untold Story of Australia and the Soviet Jews from 1959 to 89. Hello, Sam, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Good to talk to you, Diane.
In reading the title of this book, the word that jumps out is untold. The events discussed in this work, many of them tragic and devastating, happened up to 50 years ago. Why do you think this story has gone so far without being told?
There are two reasons why this has been, I think, an untold story. One is that there's an Australian dimension to it, and the second is that the people who, in many cases, participated, sadly, some of them are not around anymore, and so they can't tell the story. And until recently, many of the documents that you need for a real history weren't available until my co-author, Professor Suzanne Rutland, was able to follow them up, both at the National Archives, through the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, wiretap records, through diplomatic dispatches from Moscow to the Australian government over many years, and in many other international and particularly Soviet documentation archives which haven't until recently been available. So the story is untold to the degree that it wasn't available until now, and also because I think, as often happens with Australian history, we don't, as Australians, we're not always ready to acknowledge that Australia has a history of its own, quite independently of what else has been happening in the world, particularly in what I would call the post-war history, political history of Australia, as it relates to Australia's place in the world. Australia has focused on Asia, but there's not much around about Australia in the Cold War. What did Australia do in relation to the Soviet Union? In this case, particularly Soviet Jews and human rights. And that part is an untold story.
Well, why did you feel the need to bring the story into public consciousness?
I felt there was a need to bring the story into public consciousness because I was personally involved. I think that's the primary motive. I had had something to do with the story back in the early days. Our book covers a 30-year period, and in the period of 1959 through until the mid-60s, I was very directly involved as a journalist, but as what we now, I think, call an activist. I certainly wasn't alone. There were many of us involved, but I had a particular role to play as a journalist and editor and writer. But I think more basically, I wanted this story told, and so did my co-author, because we think it's a contribution to a better understanding of who are the Jews of Australia, on the one hand, and who have been some of the non-Jewish Australian actors in a drama. I mean, this is a drama. It spreads over 30 years and it has its ups and downs. But I think those 30 years have a beginning and they have an end. And if this were a fiction, if this were a novel, it has a happy end. And I think that drew me to the story. There's a narrative arc here. It begins in a very small way. It begins with a few individuals. It becomes a community story. It becomes a national story. It becomes an international story. And then at the end, I think good triumphs over evil. Now, you can't get anything better than that for a non-fiction story, let alone for a novel.
Yeah, great. Back to Australia's involvement. Although Australia is obviously distant from the Soviet Union, they're very much a key player in this story. I think a lot of Australians will be surprised. And why do you think that is?
I hope Australians will be surprised enough to want to buy the book, but want to understand more about the way in which the political history of Australia isn't always just about personalities. It is about national interests. It is about the way in which Australia had alliances with the United States. There's no question where Australia stood In the Cold War, certainly for most of that 30-year period, Australia was a close and very involved ally of the United States. But what isn't understood, I think, is that Australia also had its own views. Australia had its own initiatives. There were individual Australians, politicians and others, and diplomats in particular, who had a view about not only the right thing to do, morally and in terms of human rights, but what was best in Australia's national interest. Now, when you look back today, as you indicated earlier, 50 years, 60 years ago, a whole new generation of Australians don't really understand that there was a Cold War. I've spoken to young students and others who are bright, intelligent, and in every way well educated, but you might as well be talking about the Crusades. You might as well be talking about the Middle Ages.
It just seems so distant.
It is so distant, and in today's world, where what happened yesterday is already passé, it's already forgotten. The latest Twitter or the latest email has overtaken what happened literally hours ago. The idea that 50 or 60 years ago there was a great global clash of ideas, economic clash, military clash, that there were nations that went to war over the issues that divided the superpowers, and that Australia had a role to play in this and played its role, that indeed Australian troops were committed, they fought in Vietnam and in other places, which was a direct outcome of the so-called Cold War, which of course was in many cases very hot indeed. Now, the Soviet Jewry story, the story of 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union, fits into this much bigger picture. But neither the big picture nor some of the Australian elements of it are understood by a whole new generation.
Yeah, for me it was surprising as well.
Well, it's for this new generation, if I can put it that way. I think this is, in the end, what is history about? History is to remind us that even if we weren't there, things happened that actually affect the way we are today. So at that simplistic level, I'm hoping that while it may come as a surprise to a younger generation of Australians, they'll find it of interest.
Fantastic. Now, if we could go back to the book for a moment. You've had a major presence in journalism since the 60s, working as a columnist for The Age, The Australian, The Bulletin, The Sydney Morning Herald, just to name a few. Mm-hmm. Now, many people might be surprised this is your first book. And how was the process in writing a full-length book different? How was it the same?
Well, to echo something I've already said, I hope enough people are surprised that this is my first book with co-author Suzanne Rutland.
Of course.
Enough to go and buy it, just to see, well, I might have read things that Sam Lipski has written, or that, I've heard him on the radio or seen him on television or something. I'm hoping that it has a certain marketing impact. But put that aside for 1 minute. Journalism, I have to here acknowledge that some of my colleagues have been able to cope. I could never cope with both the daily, in some cases weekly, demands of journalism and the deadline, to set aside the time that I think writing a book obviously needs. It's not just a matter of time. The main difference is, even if you've written, as I have, chapters for books, even a 6,000-7,000 word chapter, it's a bit like short sprint, middle distance, and the book is the marathon. Right. And I hadn't run a marathon before, so I had to train myself a bit. And I have to say, were it not for my co-author, who is much better as an academic historian at writing books, because she's written at least a dozen, if she hadn't trained me for the marathon, I'm not sure I would have managed to get to the finishing line.
Right. Well, what was it like collaborating with Rutland?
Suzanne and I had collaborated previously. We had actually together worked on Suzanne's very important and valuable history of the Australian Jewish press back in some 20 years ago. As we talk, the Australian Jewish News is this year celebrating 120 years of continuous publication under different titles, but it's essentially the same newspaper. And 20 years ago, we celebrated the centenary of the Australian Jewish News, at which time I was the editor-in-chief. And as part of that, Suzanne Rutland was commissioned to write, by the Australian Jewish News, she was commissioned to write the history of the Australian Jewish press, and we worked together on quite a large section of the book, literally working together as writing, rewriting, editing, and so we'd had that previous experience, which I think stood us in good stead. Apart from anything else, Suzanne is, of course, an outstanding historian and meticulous in her research and footnoting, and journalists don't usually like to play around with footnotes. So I learned a great deal from her in how you set out evidence, how you quote from documents, etc., etc. So it's been, I think, a great collaboration.
Great, I agree. Now that you've run the marathon, so to speak, will you be doing that again? Is there another book in the future?
There's more than one book in the future.
Oh, excellent.
And while this turned out to be the first one, if the good Lord is kind, I hope it'll only literally be the beginning. I have to say I've got the taste for it.
Great.
Though I sometimes pretend, someone said to me, writing a book, though you're a man, you won't understand, is a bit like a woman giving childbirth. If we remembered the pain, we would never do it again. and there's a certain blotting out of memory, because the delight of holding the book in your hand, a bit like holding the baby in your hand, is so great that it overcomes any thought of what in your more sober moments you realise was the terrible bane of getting the jolly thing together. But no, there are a couple of books, maybe even 3, that I have in mind, not in this field, in quite different fields. My family keeps urging me to write memoirs. I think that's a bit of a conceit, even for journalists who are never short of conceit. Well, the good Lord has been kind. I've been around for a while. Maybe it's time to tell the story.
Great. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, and we look forward to seeing how your literary arc continues.
Thank you so much, Diane.
Thank you, Sam.